All right, guys. Happy 2021. This video is going to be finishing up the major things you're going to need to know about the rise of labor unions in the United States in the late 1800s. The first six questions in the first video is basically talking about why they're needed, why they formed, that sort of thing. So now we're going to start talking a little more about the challenges they faced. Because it wasn't like, unions, someone was like, oh yeah, unions are a good idea, let's have them, and then they just were there, right? It took time, like anything, for them to develop, and more importantly, for them to be recognized by the government. So the other thing you have to remember, right, is the fact that big business owners don't like unions. Wealthy, rich people who employ people do not like unions, right? Because unions force the employer to give higher wages, better working conditions, uh, what's the word? More benefits in your job, like health insurance, paid vacation, those sort of things. So basically, we're going to look here at how worker owners, I should say, business owners, were able to prevent, or at least attempts to prevent, the formation of unions in their businesses. Oh, sorry, I'm going to do that. All right, so in the 1870s, when unions are first starting to form, okay, again, they're not recognized by the government, they're being formed by individual citizens on their own, all right, in order to do all the things I just said. So this is usually going to lead to bloodshed, okay, because when the workers don't show up, the business owner usually does something to agitate them because they're ticked off that their workers that they pay are not showing up to work for them. Right? Makes sense. One of the biggest ones that happened was the Homestead Steel Strike, which I'll post a video on in Pittsburgh, where, like I talked about, Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie decided to fire all their workers that were going on strike and hire strikebreakers or replacement workers that would work for lower wages. That led to a bunch of people getting killed, big violent conflict right here in Pittsburgh. So talking about unions and how they can affect the country, right? So think about this, right? Back then, railroads, right, were like one of our biggest industries. Well, they were. It was our biggest industry in the country. Employed the most people, there was the most money in it, all right? And then all of a sudden, in 1877, 80,000 workers, 80,000 railroad workers across the entire country all went on strike, mainly due to the fact that their wages were being lowered and they didn't understand why. The wages were being lowered because of deflation, right? But anyway, my point is, think about what the country, think about what railroads do for the country. The country does not operate, the country does not work if railroads don't, right? Because our economies depend on the movement of massive amounts of resources, materials, products. Without railroads, you can't do that. So basically, the economy in the country shut down for like 12 days, all right? Until finally our government said, okay, we can't allow this to continue to happen. We can't allow every time there's a strike for people to kill each other or to attack each other. All right, so number 7, what did the railroad strike in 1877 make the U.S. government realize? So it's right down here at the bottom. The government realized, okay, we need a better way to deal with strikes. All right, we can't, again, allow people to keep attacking each other and killing each other simply over worker disputes. So that is 7. So unions become more and more popular as employers, right, continue to lower wages and continue to have workers work in very dangerous, deplorable working conditions. One of the first and most famous labor unions in this country that had nationwide involvement was the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor was more popular because it didn't focus its entire goals or ways of getting things done on violence like a lot of worker groups were. A lot of worker groups like, well, if you don't attack and you don't agitate the employer, he's not going to give us what we want. Well, the Knights of Labor came up with a different way of trying to force employers to give them what they want, and Martin Luther King Jr., 100 years later, will employ the same tactics to try to get African Americans more equal rights in this country. So they use something called boycotts. A boycott simply means you don't buy or pay to use a certain company's product, right? So if that company has no one buying or using their stuff, they go out of business because they're not making any money, right? So instead of striking and trying to agitate and fight physically, you simply just don't buy their stuff. This was used in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1960s. The Montgomery bus boycott by Rosa Parks, well, started by Rosa Parks, you probably heard of, right? So this is not something new, right? This is something that developed over 100 years ago. So the Knights of Labor also use arbitration. So remember what arbitration is. When both sides can't come to an agreement, you bring in a neutral party, someone who has no opinion either way. They don't care what either side gets, right? It's usually a lawyer. And then he makes a decision. Okay, I think, or he or she, I think this should be the compromise, right? I think this should be the middle ground. So number 8, what other things did the Knights of Labor support? So that's this next bullet here, number 8, right? Back then, your common workday was 12 hours. 12 hours, usually 5 to 6 days a week. You're working 60 to 70 hours a week. Think about that. You need 8 hours of sleep, and especially back then with the kind of labor you're doing. Work back then was not sit at a desk and type on a computer. It was lift 100-pound steel beams and, be around scalding hot melted steel. It's just really dangerous stuff. So like at a desk job, if you fall asleep at your desk, that's fine, right? You bump your head, big deal. You fall asleep at a steel mill, you die, right? And that event, that happened pretty frequently, right? So the 8-hour workday, which we still hold to today, comes from that time period, 1870s, 1880s, that we're talking about. Equal pay for women. It's getting better today, but it's still not the same. Women still are not paid the same as men for the most part. Child labor was a big problem, because think about this, right? If all your young people are just working and they're not getting an education, they're not bettering their skills, they're not making themselves better citizens, think about what happens to the country. It gets bad, right? Worker-owned factories, meaning factories only ran by unions. It never became popular, but it was something they supported. All those other things, though, did become popular. All right, so something happens, though, and this is number 9, in 1886, which not only hurts membership of the Knights of Labor, but hurts unions altogether. From 1886 up until the early 1890s, for roughly 5 years or so, unions are going to be kind of seen as anti-American or a bad thing. And that'll be largely through propaganda and political cartoons that these rich people are paying to, have people see and stuff. But another big one was this, the Haymarket Riot in Chicago. Basically, you had a bunch of union workers show up to Chicago, Haymarket Square, which is like right in the middle of the city of Chicago, to protest their low wages and long working hours. And like most things, you had radicals in the audience or, in the crowd. These anarchists who do not believe that countries need to have government. They believe in the overthrowing and dismissal of all governments. They threw bombs at the police officers. So what was a pretty peaceful demonstration ends up being this big, just riot, basically. People running everywhere. It's chaos. Policemen shooting at people. I mean, it's just complete and utter chaos. So at that point, employers start to pay all this money to newspapers to publish this, right? And say, look, this is what unions do, right? They cause problems. So yeah, more and more people not joining unions because of that. So if you want to pause it and read over this is just a rundown of what actually happened that day. In Chicago during the Haymarket Riot. It's everything I just explained to you. But again, severely hurts unions and union membership, at least for about a half a decade. All right. So number 10. This is the one you need to know because it's Pittsburgh history. Early 1890s, Andrew Carnegie owns a steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is Pittsburgh, and he chooses a guy named Henry Clay Frick to basically manage it for him. Henry Clay Frick was like violently anti-union, like hated unions. So he hears a rumor that the workers are going to go on strike because of their lower wages. So Frick does something that a lot of employers will do called a lockout. He tells all the workers that are on strike, you are now fired, right? You're laid off. I'm going to hire other workers that will work for the low wage that you wouldn't. So the workers, right, who don't want to lose their jobs, who want the higher wages, show up to the steel mill. And they show up and they block the doors so that the strike breakers down here, meaning the workers that will work for lower wages to replace them, can't get into the factory to work. So Henry Clay Frick hires someone called the Pinkertons, which was basically a private military that you could hire back then. You can't do that today, obviously, highly illegal. And they basically open fire on the workers and shoot and kill a number of the striking workers. So yeah, that's a big, ugly incident in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You had another one dealing with railroads called the Pullman Railroad Car Strike. Basically, what this was workers were not making railroad cars, and railroads obviously need railroad cars. So that was a big problem. I'm not going to go into real great depth on that because I don't really have it on the quiz. Okay, so by the mid-1890s, though, the same low working conditions and long working hours are going to cause unions to become popular once again. All right, so the new one that emerges after the Haymarket Riot is the American Federation of Labor. So I believe this is getting into number 10. So what are the main things that they wanted for workers? And you'll see that's on your vocab, right? The kind of the father of unions, the founder of the American Federation of Labor. So 3 main goals for number, what is this, 11? And you'll see it's all the same. For one, arbitration or collective bargaining. Collective bargaining just is the term that refers to the act of getting to arbitration. So worker-owned factories, same as the Knights of Labor, but again, does not become popular. But the big one is the 8-hour workday. Because again, if you're working 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, you don't have much of a life, if any of a life. You're going to work your life until you're dead. All right? So this creates the 40-hour work week that, well, most businesses hold to. So, being that most people in this country believe that unions are a good thing by the mid-1890s, someone gets the idea, well, wouldn't it be a great idea if we just created one worldwide union with all workers? That's just, right? It's not going to work. But that was the Industrial Workers of the World, as it was called, and that is number 12. What was the main beliefs behind it? So that's what you're getting into here for number 12. So basically, it would include every worker. If you worked, whether you worked in a factory or whether you were a skilled laborer, right, a trade worker, anyone could join this union. But the reason it didn't become popular is because it relied on violent tactics like strikes and things like that. Okay, so that is 12. Okay, women start getting in on it because women are not being paid well either. By 1900, due to industry, women made up roughly 20% of the workforce. 1 out of 5 workers was a woman. Before that, it was not like that. Women hardly worked outside of the home at all. I mean, it was probably closer to 5% before industry in terms of women working outside of their homes. Okay, so one of the most famous women labor leaders that we need to mention was Mary Harris Jones. One time was considered the most dangerous woman in America. She was very confrontational and very aggressive in her tactics, I guess you would say. Okay. So this happened in Scottsdale too, what I'm about to tell you. Being that there were so many immigrants moving into the country, employers, to try to prevent unions from forming, would go out and try to hire as many different workers as of many different nationalities as possible. They did not want their workers speaking the same language because that meant they could communicate and then they could talk about forming a union, right? So we're going to start to see unions form for all kinds of different purposes, not just to get higher wages, but for fair employment, for fair treatment in workplaces for people of color or different gender, for that matter. So, 14 immigrant workers formed what union to help protect them in the clothing industry? So that is right here. I know the name, or at least woman, is in the title, but you could still join this as a man back then. Okay, so 14, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union to help immigrants, especially in the making of clothes, because sweatshops, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, used a lot of immigrants in that factory. And the end here, other women labor leaders that will, and the reason we're mentioning them now is because they will also become major women feminists in like 1910 to 1920 when there's the big push for women's rights and women's right to vote. So Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, Leonora O'Reilly, Jane Addams, Lillian Vaughn, you'll hear about them again. But they also created a separate union for women only. Okay, this one was for women only. So number 15, okay, is the Women's Trade Union League, or WTUL, as it's otherwise referred to. Okay. All right, so that's everything for unions. I'll let you know about the open-ended question if we're going to have one in our next Zoom meeting. So finish the questions, submit them by the due date posted, and that's all for unions. All right, guys, have a good day.